Hi, this mini lecture is about teaching and assessing writing. And I just wanted to kind of talk about what is writing, what are the things we're looking for. And I've kind of put this in four different aspects. So if we look at writing or responding to text, what are the things that we're looking for? And I think we can see kind of the development of students' kind of understanding of writing and responding to text. In the way that they respond through pictures. So oftentimes students start, if they don't have the language or the words, they start by communicating information and or their understanding through pictures. And then gradually this turns into words, then into phrases, sentences, and then paragraphs, and understanding the structure of a paragraph, to more, genre writing. So understanding that there's different genres of writing. So there could be a procedure, which we often think of a recipe or instructions for something. The narrative, which we're often, we use quite a bit of telling a story. There's letter writing, and so on. So these are all genres. And it's really important to kind of think about where students are at. So if students are at the stage of they don't have any language to use and they're using pictures, it's getting them to then move up to the next step where they're starting to take those pictures and put words next to those pictures, and then phrases, and then sentences, and so on. So understanding where they are and where they need to go. I think it's important to allow students to use their first language and or pictures and symbols. Sometimes students don't, for example, let's say they're writing a sentence and they don't know a word, so they don't write the sentence at all. But if we encourage them to say, well, if you don't know a word, you can always put a picture or a symbol or use your first language, it allows them to still work on and kind of take risks in writing. So getting them to actually write instead of just going, oh, I don't know a certain word, so I won't write at all. That's really important for getting them to take those risks and getting them to see the connection between their first language and English. So letting them to write kind of bilingually, so if they don't know a word, they put their first language, is a really important skill to be able to get them to at least start using the structure of English writing and grammar, even if they don't know all the vocabulary words. I think it's really important to understand the connection between speaking and writing. So, we often use simple dictation or to get them to understand what we're saying to write it. But also it's really important to write on the board. So when you use a word, maybe there's a particular topic and you write it on the board so they actually hear what you're saying, and then they make the connection between the written version of that word. So really making a very concerted effort to make sure you are saying the words and also linking it to the written word. So it's a sound letter. They're understanding that connection. Getting them to, encouraging them to copy words or phrases. And a possibility is keeping a journal or collecting simple signs or phrases. So I think it's really important to think about, even if they are not confident enough to write freely, to be able to give them phrases or words to kind of guide them. And we'll talk about scaffolding. So oftentimes students will use kind of repetition or kind of familiar phrases, and that's okay. That's very the beginning of writing. So we often see things like in a narrative, like once upon a time, the end. Those things students kind of grab onto and they write. Even I see in university, students sometimes overly use discourse markers like moreover, further, furthermore, so on, because they know that that's a particular feature, and they sometimes overuse it. But it's because they learn these words and phrases, and that's not such a bad thing. It's really helping them understand and provide more confidence in how to write these words and phrases. If we're looking at kind of the grammatical part of writing, there's a lot of different activities you can use, such as like scrambled sentences, and we'll talk more about that. So reordering, so you have different words in the sentence, and then they have to actually put them in the right order. And this can be a simple little game that you have a variety of different sentences, and they work in groups or in pairs to reconstruct the sentences. There's a lot of verb tense games, and we'll talk more about that when we're talking about grammar. But also thinking about phonics and getting them to think about the sound of words and then how it's written. Another important thing is something like letter formation. There'll be some students who still need to understand how to form the letters, and that's really important because sometimes when students are first starting the language, they don't actually know how to form the letters, and that's really important for their development in writing. And then again, a punctuation. What are the different punctuation marks? What are their purpose? And so on. It's also important for students to understand the meta-language, so understanding what is a noun, what is a subject, what is a verb, what is an object. These things all help. So if they understand them, then the teacher can use them and they can notice them in sentences. They can understand them and know the different formula for grammatical sentences. So it's really important for them to know and understand what those words mean and see examples of them. The other thing is that, if we're thinking about kind of the conventions of language use or the meaning of language use, it's really important to understand that students understand the differences between spoken and written language. One of the things that we often see is contractions, like do not becomes don't. And that's very much a spoken language sort of thing, but we see it in our writing. But understanding that the difference is that we don't always, sometimes written language is much more formal and spoken is more informal. So understanding those differences is also very important. Also understanding the audience and purpose of text. So if you're writing an advertisement or advertisement, you are really trying to persuade. And another simple way is looking at signs and seeing what is the sign trying to tell us. If we have a stop sign, we know that means stop. Or what is the purpose? So understanding that is important, because when they are writers, they need to then understand what is the purpose of them writing the text. And this is really important for them understanding that there are different genres and features of different writing genres. Some different language strategies that students can use for writing are things like formulaic language, as I mentioned, familiar language that they know, and models or outlines, getting them to see how things are written and then and highlight the features of them and try to repeat them. And that can be a really helpful strategy. Again, for writing, using and having access to dictionaries and vocabulary lists are also very important. If you'd like to know, there's more in the additional, or it's on Moodle at the very last section, which I believe is post activities and looking forward. There is also a PowerPoint by Bao, and I will incorporate some things, but he does write about scaffolding. And scaffolding is really an important thing. So how do we actually support the development of students' writing? I'll give a few things in here. I think one of the things we can really use oral language and speaking to students to scaffold writing. Obviously, reading is another scaffold. The more that students read, the more they're understanding different words and context and so on. But one way to do this is, if we can tell stories, get the students to draw the story, then put words to the story, then sentences, and then paragraphs. This kind of shows the development of how students take oral language to writing a text. You can use collaborative or shared writing. So what happens is the teacher acts as a scribe, so they write, and students are actively involved in the planning, drafting, and publishing of the text. Now, some teachers might decide to do a shared writing or collaborative writing as a class every time they meet. So for 10 to 20 minutes in every class, they all contribute to a shared piece of writing that hopefully by the end of the term or the unit, they have something written, but they bit by bit work towards it. So, it's getting them to understand as a class, so who is the audience and what is the purpose? So you're really modeling to students, before we start writing, what is going to be the topic and what is the purpose? And this is a really important thing that sometimes we don't get our students to think about. Who is the audience for what we're writing and what is the purpose? and getting them to display and use a model for student writing. So once this shared writing activity is done together, so you collaboratively guide students in the planning and drafting and publishing of the text, and then that becomes a model for student writing. But they were also actively engaged in it, so it could be a very powerful way to use a model of writing to help guide students. If you use writing models, so an example of a writing task, and then you can have students highlight or label and discuss the features. So what are the things that we can see in this text? What are the kinds of language used? What's the grammar used? Do they use past tense, future tense? What kinds of things do they use? And what are the features? So we can see things in, for example, a narrative, that there would be a description of the setting and so on, but then different for procedure text. So really getting them to see what are the features that make each text different. There's something from Annandale and colleagues, and they talk about the gradual release of responsibility. And I think this is I really like this model. So it's getting the students to, when you're thinking about scaffolding students' writing ability, you're looking at first getting students exposed to a lot of different examples of the type of text you're trying to do. So if it's narratives, if you're trying to get them to understand how to write a story, you're exposing them to a wide range of examples of narratives. So you're getting them to understand and getting them to familiarize themselves with this. The next step is you get them to analyze them. You get them to look at these different examples and look at the organization. So, oftentimes we look at headings or things like that. Chapters. How is it organized? Can they actually look and think about what are the rules for creating this type of text? Are there certain rules? Do they need to have chapters? Do they need to have once upon a time for a fairy tale? What do they think are the rules for writing this kind of text? The next stage is modeling, and this is where the teacher, this is where the explicit teaching comes in. They're demonstrating and explaining the type of text, and basically the teacher's thinking aloud about the mental processes of when writing. So what are the things that someone writing this kind of text need to think about? So the teacher's actually talking through the different texts and really getting students to notice the different features. The students are participating and so on. The teacher can model writing something out, so maybe they're writing a kind of text and getting students to look through. The next stage, so that's modeling. The teacher models what the students would need to do to write a text like this. The next is sharing. So the teacher actually continues to do this, but invites the students to contribute ideas. So the students actually take an active role in collaborating to a shared text. So it doesn't have to be a whole text, it could be part of text, but the teacher can ask questions, and the teacher actually contributes different ideas to creating a shared text. The next one is where the teacher scaffolds students to use to actually compose the text, and the teacher provides feedback. So students work independently or as a group, but the teacher really helps scaffold them to compose the text, to create the text. So the teacher is guiding and then applying. And this is where, while the guiding, it's very much scaffolded and the teacher is helping maybe students work in groups or so on. Then applying is the students do work independently and the teacher helps support. So this is kind of the gradual release of responsibility, and a really good guide to think about how you might support and scaffold students' learning. Now, some of these things I've taken from Dat Bao, from his PowerPoint, and looking at the different kinds. We have controlled writing tasks and more free writing tasks. So examples of controlled writing tasks would be things like a dictation, where you read out a text and students are writing. And usually dictation, doesn't have to be long. It might be a few words at a time to a sentence where students listen to it a few times. A dictogloss is longer and usually provides a bit more, similar to a dictation, but teacher reads maybe a short text and students work in groups to reconstruct the text. So dictation can be something very short. Dictogloss is more looking at kind of the gist of a text, and it is a bit longer, and they usually do this collaboratively to try to reconstruct the text after the teacher has read aloud this text. Another option is gap filling and or close technique. So students listen to something and they're actually filling in the gaps. And close is much more structured. Maybe it's every fifth word and they're actually filling that in. Reordering words, so that's kind of like the scrambled sentences. So they have a whole bunch of words and they have to reorder the words to make them grammatically correct. So now we're kind of linking into the more grammatical sorts of things, but also for meaning, getting them to understand that the order of the words create certain meanings. Substitution, this is where, you know, there's maybe a blank and they have 4 to 5 choices of words that they could put in there, or there's a word and they have to think of a synonym or something like that. Correcting facts to match a text or picture. So you have a text and then you have some pictures and there's some discrepancy. There's something wrong. So you have to actually correct the text to match the picture. And as we've discussed before, is writing based on a model text. So you have a model text and you basically write something a little bit different, but you follow the structure of the model. Now, there are some examples of more free writing tasks. So, you know, something like complete the news or stories provided by the teacher. So, you know, the thing I regret most about my life is this. So this is a bit more open-ended and so on. So you fill in the blanks. Other things that you can use as discussed by Dat Bao is using, you know, writing a poem on a provided format. Continuing each other's writing. So maybe someone starts a sentence and then it, you know, moves on to someone else, or, you know, one student writes a paragraph and then another student starts writing something. So it can be either just 2 people writing, finishing off each other's writing, or it can be several and it goes along to create a story. And this can be different genres, so it can be news, it can be stories, it can be poems. Writing an advertisement or brochure to convince people about the quality of products or services. Reconstructing a story from pictures. So you have pictures and you have to actually tell the story from the pictures. And I quite like this one. I think that's a really good way to look at pictures and be able to reconstruct the story. You can also incorporate a retell of the story. So tell the story. So you write it and then you have to actually, without looking at the writing, tell the story to check fluency. Exchanging letters between a company. So you can write letters between a company and customers, or a reader and a columnist from a newspaper, a manager and a complaining customer. So these are things of letters, writing for different purposes, and this is where students really have to understand why they are writing it. Write the story of your shoes or cars or watch. There's an example of this in the handouts or in the additional file folder that you can have a look at. And then creating instructions for operating a device. So how do I use a particular kitchen device, or how do I use a computer? All these sorts of things, creating instructions. So very much more of a procedural task. There's also more general things like keeping a journal, getting students to take a journal and have specific questions that they have to answer. Responding to a quote, having a quote and getting students to think about, well, what does this quote mean, and so on. For younger students, you can have a definitions poster, like a friend is, and they have to use words to describe what a friend is. And then kind of the idea of rewriting an ending to a story. So maybe it's a familiar story and students have to rewrite it. Or maybe in that shared example, a collaborative writing task that students, you know, together came up with an ending, but then at some point they can choose a different ending and respond. Now, there is this is the guided writing process that you would use. So getting students to write first you'd get them to brainstorm. Now you can do this by doing like a mind map or concept map, getting them to have discussions. There's lots of ways you can brainstorm. Then getting them to write an outline. And this is a really important thing for structuring ideas. Then a rough draft, evaluating it using a checklist, so they do some self or peer evaluation. Then they have a final draft, which they submit for a grade, and then finally they publish, so incorporating maybe technology or art, so a final published sort of thing, and this might go into their portfolio, they might share it with their parents and so on. And now each part of this has kind of feedback and assessment. So the final draft might be submitted for a grade, but even in the brainstorming and the outline and the rough draft, the teacher should be giving kind of formative feedback. And then the publishing is really an opportunity for students to share, with parents and with others, and really having kind of a finished product. The last kind of bit I wanted to talk about, and this again is by Dat Bao, is talking about how getting students to think about a sentence and pushing them to look at the sentences they've already created and how can they improve it. So one thing is combining, getting them to take a simple sentence and make it compound, so compound sentence, combining two sentences, or having a complex sentence, so having them, have a, looking at different ways to combine their sentences and have a more complex sentences. So really understanding the difference between those different types of sentences and getting them to combine sentences, because particularly students who are really trying to be careful, they will write a lot of simple sentences and it will seem very disjointed. So getting them to use different types of sentences like compound and complex sentences. Rearranging sentences, and again this might be for emphasis or whatever, but getting them to rearrange sentences, looking at different types of grammar. Emphasizing, if they want to emphasize something, providing italics or getting them to really emphasize certain words. So thinking about how to emphasize certain words in a sentence. Subtracting, so sometimes students use words that they don't need or ideas that they don't need, so getting them to also, and this is something hard for university students, is they write a paper and it's over the word count. How do you actually narrow that down? And that's a skill that they have to learn. Expanding, adding information that the audience needs to know. So you can expand in a variety of ways. You can expand by getting them to provide more descriptive language, and so on. So getting them to expand a sentence. So these are all just ideas on how students can improve a sentence. So again, just a mini lecture on some kind of concepts, ideas in not only teaching writing, but also to think about how you might assess writing. So things like, how do I make sure that they can actually combine sentences? Well, then you have a little test that gets them to have some sentences and get them to combine them, or rearrange, have a list of words and how do they rearrange it for, to make sense. So all of these different tasks that can be then used for assessing. Now, in the face-to-face lecture, you'll talk more about things like using writing codes, and that's ways to correction codes to get students, ways to give feedback to students, but give them responsibility to have to actually find out what the right word is. So, for example, if they've spelled a word wrong, instead of telling them the right word, you actually provide a symbol so that they have to go back and spell it correctly. So these are all things, ways to give some more formative feedback and tasks that will help them improve and so on. And we'll talk a little bit more about that assessment of writing in class. So hopefully this was helpful. Have a lovely week. Bye.